span the vast unknown, and this new life is cast. We are going to talk about the long disaster. And so I'm going to invite in now Nick Farr and Lia Holland. So here we go. Welcome to the show. Hey, how's it going? Nice to see you, Nick.
Nice to see you too.
You're looking good.
Thank you.
Galactic.
and Nick has been a long time camper with BWB, and I just want to give a personal shout out to you, Nick, because when I was camping there last year, you literally found every bit of technical thing that I could possibly need. You're a wizard at the camp. You're a wizard in the world, and I'm so grateful to have you here. And Leah, this is my first time meeting you. You're coming at us from Europe at the moment. Is that true?
No, do I have my VPN on?
or maybe it says Holland and I got confused.
Yeah, I'm in Portland, Oregon.
Oh, there you go. See, that's what happens when you read the words wrong. Well, so happy to have you here as part of our BWB speaker and performance series today. And we're going to leave this camera on because we have to, but we're going to move into just speaker mode. So I'm going to turn the floor over to the both of you. And thanks so much for being with us.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's so great to be here with you in the infinite Playa. And hello, warm greetings to everybody. Despite the fact that I am working all of this week, I did manage to make it into one of the many multiverses, and I'm so happy to be here with you. And I am super, super, super stoked and grateful and thrilled to have my dear friend and collaborator on the long disaster here, Lia Holland. Just so that you know, this half-hour talk is about the long disaster. It's a piece that I wrote, and Leah was so gracious to give me amazing feedback on it and help me refine it and help get sort of the real message of what I wanted to get across. And Leah's been an incredible counsel and guidance. In that, if you'd like to read it, it's at longdisaster.org. And I should also take this opportunity to give a warm thanks to Christopher Breedlove and Molly Rose and everybody at BWB who have been really great supporters of the concept and of the idea behind it. The whole thing came about at the BWB Summit at Fly Ranch 2 Mays ago, which is where I met Leah. And Leah, how did you end up in the BWB orbit? I'll explain how I got there in a minute, but I'd like to know how you ended up at the BWB Summit out at Fly Ranch in May.
Yeah, I had collaborated with Christopher Breedlove on a variety of projects for a festival event out in Michigan when he used to live in Chicago. And we just always stayed connected. I think that his and my mind and orientation toward art and festival community as a vessel for social change and social development, education, we're just so aligned that we just always stayed connected. And he would invite me often to events and I would never be able to come. And then this time, finally, I said, enough is enough and I have to get my butt out there. I haven't actually been this is my first Burning Man right here since 2008, I believe. So it's been a while for me in terms of the dust and all of you wonderful people, but yeah, I'm super grateful to be here and very aligned with the work that Burners Without Borders does.
And I was just about to say, you preempted me a little bit, that I finally managed to drag you to Burning Man. I've been trying to get you to come out to the Playa ever since we were together at Fly Ranch back in May. And so if you take nothing else away from this conversation, the point behind the long disaster is that, and I let me take a step back. I ended up coming to BWB. I'd been a long time burner, but at that point, my Burning Man career had taken a very long pause. I have a lot of experience in disaster recovery, disaster relief in a lot of different contexts, seismic, structure collapse recovery, different things like that. And I, through lots of different things, ended up becoming the volunteer coordinator at one of the most disastrous building collapse sites in Mexico City, which happened to be 3 blocks away from my house at the time in Mexico City. Burners Without Borders was instrumental in providing a lot of equipment that I needed for that particular action. It wasn't a BWB action per se. It was one of those things where a friend of mine in BWB said, "Hey, Nick, what do you need?" And I said, "I need this long list of stuff that's hard to get in Mexico," and they made it happen. And that was amazing. And the reason I ended up at the BWB Summit at Fly Ranch back in May was to talk about that experience. The funny thing was, I didn't really get a chance to talk about that experience. I was going in there thinking, oh, I'm, hey, oh, hero conquering, blah, 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 this other stuff like that. And I'll talk about how, what a heroic person I am. And when I got there, when I started talking to Tom, when I, in the 6-hour conversation that you and I had, Leah, it was the first time I really had a chance to reflect on the sort of background of what became the long disaster. And ultimately the point is, rushing in like conquering heroes into a disaster is ultimately unsustainable. I know, Leah, we talked a little bit about sort of the hero myth, and I think you're much better than I am at explaining that whole concept of why it's so alluring to go in and to try to be a hero, and why in a lot of ways we're programmed to, see disaster and then rush in to try to fix it. I'm fishing for the question and all of that, but yeah. In our conversation about the hero archetype, how did you think that related to not just my story, but the other stories that you heard at BWB? And I guess sort of the origin myth of BWB coming out of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans.
That's a big one. So I think that the first acknowledgement is that affluent culture, white culture in particular, we've been sort of raised on hero stories to a large extent of the Superman swooping in into a context, that in which people who he doesn't know and will probably never interact with again need to be saved, and that he's there as the conquering savior, and then he disappears and they love him and their lives are better. And I think that as a culture, we're really at a place now where we're expunging that myth from our understanding of reality and doing a much more systemic analysis of why these disasters are happening in the first place, and also how we can move to serve to perhaps prevent them instead of letting them play out to their natural conclusions, which are often, devastating and something beyond even the capacity of heroes to solve. So that is, that's more or less where my thinking comes from on that, is that we need to and are actively in the process in this moment of dispelling the hero myth from individuals and finding a new way to talk about it as a collective and as a way of life, that we exist to help each other and not just to rush out somewhere with people that we don't know to save them from something that we may not be, or even if we are, very educated about, but that ultimately is, a problem that more people than just ourselves need to be empowered to solve.
I don't mean to underemphasize the real trauma of people who are going through real trauma because of the pandemic, because of state violence, because of racism and these things like that. But as overall, in an overarching way, especially in our more privileged societies, as this pandemic sort of rips open bare a lot of the failing of our society in the way that it's structured, and tearing apart the hero myth, do you think that for a lot of people who lead relatively normal, relatively privileged, relatively isolated lives, do you think one of the sort of things that makes this pandemic really hard and traumatic for people who are not accustomed to dealing with trauma is the notion of this hero myth just getting tossed into the shredder with every piece of news that kind of comes out as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that to a large extent, the people who are really struggling in this time, in terms of the pandemic and the non-immediate health implications of the pandemic, I would say also, but the people who are struggling mentally and emotionally with the isolation and the lack of certainty seem to be often looking for that hero again. And the people who I see who are maybe not thriving, but in a good place mentally, who are here for the long haul, who are focused, who are grounded, are the people who are taking action to be a part of the collective savings of ourselves. And this is really, you know, an illustrative disaster that obviously we didn't have back in May 2018 when we were first talking about all of this. But at this moment now here, we're able to see that in real time, a disaster that can't be solved by anything but collective action and collective understanding, and that is being made worse by really deep systemic roots of neglect and lack of focus on community resiliency across the nation and the world.
No, exactly, and that was, you bring up a good point. When I feel like it feels inappropriate to say that I wrote it. I feel like I was perhaps more of a conductor and a collaborator, and you were a huge part of that collaborative effort in helping flesh out the ideas.
You wrote it.
Yeah, okay. But it's important to note that this was written long before the COVID epidemic was even on anybody's radar. That when I was looking at it, I thought the pace of disasters, just with climate change, hurricanes, earthquakes, all of the things that we're doing to the planet are just increasing the pace, severity, and reach of all of these natural disasters. I actually wasn't anticipating, well, I don't know if pandemic was a word that I put in the original document or that you suggested to put in the original document. That really drives home the point. We don't have to explain the concept of the long disaster to anybody here. And that if we work our way out of this viral pandemic, we still have global climate change and all of the other things, as mentioned, coming in there. And like I said before, the one thing I want you to walk away, the one thing I want people to walk away from this conversation with is that, yes, you're going to be much more likely to be tempted to become a hero, to see the results of a hurricane and want to rush in and fix that, when really the best way, and perhaps the only way, like you've pointed out, that we have forward in fixing the long disaster, whether it's this pandemic, whether it's responding to state violence, are community efforts. And you live in Portland, you're in what I see from the outside as a big hub of community collaborative efforts. And I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about some of those things that you're seeing on the ground in Portland, and about other efforts that you've been engaged in that are the exactly kind of hyper-local collective activities, or supporting hyper-local activities from through direct grants. And I don't want to steer your thunder, but I wanted you to bring up all those things.
Yeah, let's see. I think that just referencing back to the text of the long disaster, which you really should read as a companion to this conversation, the idea of disaster being finite, and that the Herculean effort of response as something that is sustainable or warranted or appropriate definitely is not an orientation that activists on the ground in Portland who are resisting fascism and advocating for, the importance of Black lives are under any illusion that that exists, or that's a way to approach these types of efforts. We're coming up on 100 days of Black Lives Matter protests in Portland now, And the way that that is happening, as far as, you know, like I can tell from, you know, my involvement and presence on the ground, and also just listening and learning, is that for many of these communities who are engaged in this struggle, they don't have the sense that I, as a white person, have, that infrastructure will be provided, or that justice will show up, or that money will be, you know, able to solve these problems. And so I see, you know, there are community efforts on the ground to feed people, to collect supplies, et cetera, all up and down the line of the different means of fueling our bodies and spirits to keep the resistance going. Those are collective efforts. Those are hand-to-hand, individual people organized efforts that any of us are capable of without the need to feel or take on that mantle of the hero. It's just what people are doing and how people are living in Portland in a way that is, for almost everyone, pretty traumatic, but also for many sustainable in a way, because we aren't alone and we aren't standing alone. So that's really important, I think, to understand that disaster is becoming less and less finite. and it is going to be in the ways that we live and the ways that we renew each other, and, you know, step in and out and take time to, like, weave our lives around engaging in activism and resistance, that we will become, you know, long disaster responders, as Nick's article says. And I think that the micro grant thing that you were referring to, Nick, was an effort at the start of COVID with one of the organizations that I've worked with in the past, where we really wanted to seed among young people the idea of this sort of collectivist action, and the idea of individual action, asking yourself what you can do in this immediate time at the start of lockdown, when people are afraid and people are isolated and we're all adjusting to this new reality in a really traumatic way. So we put this ask out to hundreds of members of this community: what can you do? Tell us, and we'll give you the money to do it. And scrap the entire plan for that entity for that year in order to respond and model for others what effective response looks like, even on a small scale with a micro grant of $100 or something like that. So I think that the two main takeaways there are resistance as a way of life, and also teaching, even if on a small scale, because this is definitely a new way of thinking that's unfamiliar to most people, and a way of thinking that I think that we as a species need in order to survive and to justify our presence on the planet at this point.
And it's amazing you bring that up, because one of the things that I've always, and one of the things that I've always admired about Burning Man is that, in a way, and this isn't a universal experience of Burning Man by any means, but in a way, there are a lot of people who are incredibly privileged, and you do have to either have access to or be privileged, in a sense, to go to Burning Man. On the Playa, in the multiverse, fortunately, all you need is a laptop and internet connection. It's actually
don't have.
And that's also true. That's also very good to remember. And then, of course, making a trip out to the Playa requires even more privilege, and for those who do not have an extreme level of privilege, sacrifice. But it's where people of privilege go to practice for the apocalypse. For a lot of privileged people that I know who lead really lives of incredible comfort, it's the one time in their lives where they put themselves in a position of discomfort, of dis-ease, of not being able to have access to all of those things that they can purchase with money obtained through their networks and things like that. And in a lot of ways, it forces people to struggle with things and forces them to recognize that a lot of the world is out of their control. It's a situation somewhat analogous to people who don't have privilege. Of course, the critical difference being that people without the same amount of privilege, that is their life. That for many people, and as we're finding out in this world, just the raw art of living and survival is living through a disaster. And of course, the target piece, the target audience for the long disaster were generally more privileged people, even though eventually we're more likely as a species, as a society, to be reduced to a level of lacking privilege as opposed to what we aspirationally would like in being able to lift people up into a position of privilege. And getting back to Burning Man, it's because of that I think burners especially are generally more receptive to this. Now, of course, being in the aftermath of a hurricane or in the aftermath of a pandemic or in the aftermath of something is far different, and having to source different things and rely on your neighbors and look to people that you don't know that are in your community for life-sustaining aid. Just as in Black Rock City, you should be able to walk up to any stranger's area if they have water, and they should happily give you water. Sadly, that notion does not exist in a lot of privileged spaces, in a lot of spaces anywhere in this country, but it probably should. And that's another one of the things behind the long disaster that I was trying to get at. There are amazing things to carry away from the Burning Man experience. The living in a gift economy, living in that area where almost by default you can trust a stranger. Whereas one of the things about modern Western privileged white existence is stranger danger, in a sense. And I think Burning Man has a lot to teach us about moving towards a society and a world where we can trust our neighbors, but getting there is going to be challenging. Also, it's the only way that we're going to be able to not just survive, but thrive in the context of the long disaster as a whole. I was going to ask you a little bit about one of the sort of minor points in there. I actually, and I know you fought me a little bit on this, I think, when I was writing it, but I wanted to try to put the 10 principles of Burning Man in the piece and demonstrate that the 10 principles of Burning Man are a great way to run a festival, but they're also a great set of principles for being in the world. You know, wouldn't it be great if one of the things that we're seeing right now when we're talking about amplifying Black voices, when we're talking about looking at state violence, is that we have not been radically inclusive of all voices. We have not valued radical self-expression, radical self-reliance, and a lot of these same principles in our society at large. And I know you fought me a little bit about including the principles when we were writing the piece, but it's very much a work that's not only informed by, you know, Burners Without Borders and things like that, but by Burning Man, and to a certain extent about festival culture. So I was going to ask you, as somebody who's been involved in a lot of different festivals, what are some of the lessons that you see that you can take away from festival culture, and what are some parallels that you've perhaps seen in a lot of these responses to current issues, where there are some parallels and some analogies there that you've noticed?
You know, it was really interesting as you were talking about that, and specifically the idea of radical self-reliance. And in my mind, I was relating it back to the thought of the, you know, the hero complex, the hero industrial disaster relief complex, and that perhaps the thing that, you know, we need to think about, you know, with all of these principles and these things that we so love and value about the community at these festivals that we create is the idea of the radical self-reliance extending into the community, or your sense of self extending beyond your, you know, your body down the line to the implications of your actions. And that, because, let's see, so John Perry Barlow said, your life does not belong to you. Don't waste it, or don't squander it frivolously, or something like that. And that's always been like a really guiding principle of, you know, of my life, and kind of how I see people coming to these alternative communities and alternative realities, is with the thought that, you know, like my vibe, which could be, you know, like, which really extends down to like your actions and how you're moving in the world, how you're contributing and how you're giving back, are fundamentally things that we need to be thinking about all the time, and not just at these events. And so, like, for, I think across every festival event that I've ever worked at, volunteered at, been a part of, it's, you know, that reliance and trust on each other, and that deep commitment to the community of the event, and to making the event magical, and fueling it, and wanting it to continue, and wanting it to grow, and wanting to teach other people how to be a part of it, is something that I universally also hear those same people saying that they wish could exist in default reality. And I think that the long disaster is also a way to think about responding to the disaster of our disconnection, and the disaster that, you know, that hasn't extended into the community at large, and into the world at large, and that we aren't taking that with us out into the world in the ways that we could. And how better, what better invitation do you have than a global pandemic and the racial justice uprising and state violence to use the tools that you have to lift other people up who may be less fortunate than you.
As we're going into our final couple of minutes here, I wanted to also emphasize that while the long disaster is talking about resiliency and community and the need to build connections, I don't, and even though that, you know, one of the earlier names of it was the forever disaster, but we settled on long disaster because it's, in my personal view, it's pointless to put out a work which says, or even gives a subtle meaning that says all hope is lost. That's not the point of the long disaster at all. The point of the long disaster is that if we reach out to our neighbors, if we work on building community, if we work on figuring out what are the beautiful threads that come out of festivals, and how can we bring that joy into our communities every day as we're building stronger, more resilient, healthier communities, as we're working to restructure our society, that there's that I think a lot of the calls that we have now that are being dismissed are urgent needs to restructure our society fundamentally, to be more verdant, to be more just, to be more response, and to be more caring and loving, just as we are caring and loving to each other in the context of festivals. You don't see a huge, you know, the police are not intervening a lot in places like Burning Man, in places like in other festivals and other contexts, because you have people that fundamentally care for each other. The more we care for each other in our communities, the less we need external forces like policing, as one example. And on that note, ask, what do you have hope for the future in that context?
It's a hard, it's a hard thing to talk about hope in the midst of such day-to-day violence and oppression. But I also, you know, am myself personally privileged enough to balance that pain and that experience of oppression with a lot of time in nature, and a lot of time seeing the world through the eyes of the, you know, the animal that I am, just like any other species on the planet. So I really do have a lot of hope for the resiliency of the world and its ability to recover from, you know, the humanity, as it were. And I see among us many people who I believe deserve and belong to be a part of that future. And I work every day to try to be one of those people too. So I don't know, I have hope in this moment, and I have hope in the people I collaborate with, and I have hope in the planet, even if I'm not there for that recovery. So I don't know if that's the optimistic answer that you want, but I think that we really have to take it on if we want a brighter future.
I agree. That is an honest answer, that if we don't make some fundamental changes, whether it's to our politics, to our economics, or to the way that we consume resources, consume and produce resources on this planet, the future does not look very bright. At the same time, and even though the tone of a lot of different things is incredibly negative right now, when you pick up a newspaper, when you talk to people, when you look at the COVID death counts, just as, and I don't mean to make light of recent forest fires, but in nature, one of the reasons, you know, what happens in the aftermath of a lot of forest fires is regrowth, rebirth, bringing about a new way that is hopefully more resilient, more sustainable, better part of evolution and things like that. And that's why while I am in a lot of ways a realist, I don't tend towards optimism. There's an opportunity right now. And I think the core point of what you were saying is that this is our world to do with correctly, or to fall back on, continue, you know, living in the denial that we've lived in, or do the hard work of getting to meet our neighbors, getting to know them, working on projects, working on sharing our resources as opposed to hoarding them as individuals. And I'm hopeful that this pandemic that got here a lot sooner than I thought it would is going to teach us and raise people by default to be more community minded, to be more community oriented, and to work collectively, because really I don't see another way out. Do you?
No, I think that, I mean, in a world where everyone did all they could, we'd be fine.
But we have to bear in mind and do what we have to be sustainable about our efforts, which means it's, as I am constantly reminded by Molly and Christopher, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And self-care is a very important part of personal sustainability. It's not an excuse to not do something, but at the same time, do what you can. And instead of thinking about how can I go be a hero, how can I be humble and serve my community and bring about a true global change? And so I think we're about 5 minutes over time, and I hope I'm not taking away too much time from Christopher or anybody like that who's free to come in. I know I'm looking forward to the community roundup that's coming up soon. One of my favorite, the funny thing about this whole pandemic is one of my only social times outside of work were our Wednesday night calls. And while I'm here, I might as well also bring up on Sunday mornings at 8 o'clock Pacific, we have a group called Together We Grow, which is exactly one of those community things. We literally just talk about growing things for 2 to 3 hours, whether it's, you know, and we've had people who are calling in on Zoom from their fire escape in Harlem. And we've had people from intentional communities in the Central California Valley talking about their beautiful, amazing farms, people in Arizona, people from France. We've had people even from Guatemala calling in, all talking and sharing their knowledge about how we grow food And that's a wonderful call that I participate in. And Eamon, you're back.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you so much, Leah. Thank you so much for the essay, and that is The Long Disaster, and that is available. What is the URL to go read that? I know you let people know.
Longdisaster.org.
Longdisaster.org. Thank you both for being part of this today.
Harden ourselves up to the ones who died. Look in my eyes. Tell me the cost of the life that we're living. Armed with lies.